Thanks, Rabbi Kelman. It's a pleasure to be with you. If you turn on your videos, it'll be easier because then I can kind of figure out who I'm talking to. What Rabbi Kelman failed to mention is I got my start in yelling and activism with a cousin of his who had season tickets to the New York Rangers. And being the only New York Islander fan in the blues section, at the time was the blues section of Madison Square Garden, meant you had to, I guess, stand out there. And so thanks are due to your cousin Ira Kelman and your cousins Ari and Michael, who so included me in those games. And then, I don't know if activism is the right word, but when you grow up in a family that's involved in community, which mine was, my parents, my grandparents on the west side of Manhattan. So it's kind of in your blood. The kind of turning point in my aliyah story, and I grew up in a Zionist household, one infused with Torah values. But the turning point, meaningfully, was something that happened to me in Yeshivat Har Etzion when I was a gap year student, like the rest of you, which predates the story that Rabbi Kelman told about Yeshiva University. And I found myself right after the Gulf War. It wasn't a pandemic, but there was a war and an intifada, war across the country, Scud missiles falling from Iraq, and an intifada down the road from Yeshivat Har Etzion at the time in the Gush. And right after the Gulf War ended, I found myself in a room with 15 people with Harav Yehuda Mital Zatzal, was the Rosh Yeshiva, one of the Rosh Yeshivas of the Gush. And I asked him if he thought there was a bigger mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael for somebody who would make aliyah and move to an unpopulated or less populated area of the country, the Galil, the Negev, Yudah Shomron, or if you moved to Yerushalayim and or Tel Aviv, it'd be the same mitzvah. And he looked at me and said, "Zakosh diot, it's all nonsense. You should move to Israel and set up a factory that'll employ 10,000 people to earn an honest and good and decent living." And it was really the first time that in a spiritual sense, somebody had kind of challenged me that the economy was fundamentally important to our life in Israel. And that, at that point, that became a life pursuit to try to see if I could help employ 10,000 people. The economy changed. There are no factories that I'm involved with. Software and high tech became far more important to the global economy, to the Israeli economy, which is where I find myself for the last 25 years. But that remains the goal. 10,000 plus jobs, and you have to keep moving the goalposts on it to try to get to as many as possible. To Rabbi Kelman's previous question, after my 2 years in an Elul in the Gush, I went back to YU and finished up my degree, having already decided I would make aliyah, and finished up the degree in YU, and I guess was fortunate in a bizarre way that there was a controversy erupted, or we discovered it more accurately, where they wanted to close the Bernard Revel Graduate School. And I wasn't actually the activist, I was just the reporter and then the editor of the paper, but I had discovered it. And it became quite a brouhaha. I don't think since the 60s anyone had chained themselves to a building or stormed the president's office at the time with a drum. It was pretty unruly for typical yeshiva university behavior. And it ultimately resulted in YU not closing down that graduate school. And it taught me about the power of voice and the power of galvanizing. If you believe in something, you can stand up for it. I got not a few threats that they wouldn't like me to spend too much more time in YU when I was there by various deans of different things. But we believed in it. And Maury's cousin, Michael, was my co-editor of the newspaper. And we kind of went after this. We continued to go after this. And at the time, and it was important. And we wrote other things at the time about the importance of Zionism and how staying in America is, I called it at the time, armchair Zionism, which I believe until this day. And that if you wanted to get up and do something, you actually had to get up and do something. And so right after college, I was fortunate enough to meet my wife, on the summer to my junior and senior year of YU. I interned in Israel because I planned to move here. And I met my wife that summer, my now wife that summer. We got back engaged, married, graduated YU, and within 6 or 8 weeks, we're on a plane to Israel and moved here. And I started in political consulting. I like to joke that I've repented since then. And found my way into venture capital, or a variant of it, in the mid 90s, which was really the start of the high tech industry in Israel. There was amazing government program called Yozma, which initiated the Israeli venture capital business. And I was kind of around at roughly the same time and propelled forward by what has been just an unbelievable growth of the Israeli high tech system. I'll stop and open a set of parentheses. It has always stunned me. I used to go back to YU and talk about this, as to why Jews in Israel were able to pursue the creative part of the economy in high tech. And Jews in America, particularly Orthodox Jews in America, continued to go to the professions of yesteryear. And even though that's changed a fair amount in the last 5 years, there's more STEM, there's more people going into into entrepreneurship or into tech companies. It's still not in the mainstream. And that is, I think, a failing of the American Jewish educational system. It's getting better, but creation and creativity, which is a Jewish concept, that's what we're put in this world to do. That's the Tzelem Elokim in every person. God creates, we create, not the same level. That's the idea. Does not seem to be as pervasive in the American Jewish community today, and I don't know why that is. Like I said, the winds of change are starting, but they're late. And so I was fortunate enough to kind of get caught up in this upswing of the Israeli tech business. And I've been a venture capitalist, which means I invest in startup companies, early stage innovation, for the last 25 or so years. And when we raised Aleph, which is the fund I set up in 2013 with my partner, Ed and Shochat, and since then we've been joined by a third partner, Aaron Rosenson, who moved from Chicago and New York to Israel to join us. We always said that our big dream was to build a company that would employ thousands of people in Israel, be an Israeli company, be a $10-50 billion business, and would have an Israeli flag planted in the front garden of the office. And I think that kind of summarizes what we're after here, which is, how do you build a uniquely Israeli economy? What does it stand for, and what's important in it? I'll pause for a second for questions, because these can sound like monotonous monologues on these Zooms, with everyone in like the Hollywood Squares cubes and one guy talking all the time. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to pause. Or more you want to ask me, I think also fine.
Yeah, so if you want to just maybe talk about how you came to Israel really by yourself with your wife, and you didn't have the connections that often in Israel people have through army, through youth groups, which is a major factor in Israel. Who protects you, etc. So how did you navigate that in terms of coming as a young couple and that transition to where you are in the VC world? If you can talk a little bit about that, the challenges of an Oleh to break into Israeli society, business society.
I was just telling somebody on a podcast that's going to be published next week that even after being here 27 years, there are like still some things you can't figure out. Like, you're an immigrant once, you're an immigrant forever. You kind of, and I think even my children, despite my American accent and my fluent Hebrew, would tell you that I'm among the most integrated American immigrants into Israeli society. I chair a deeply Israeli organization called the Shomer Chadash. I'm pretty well into it. Still, as my friend Victor Austin, who learned me in Yeshiva, says, there's something they just don't tell you when you get off the boat. And forever, it's not the same. That having been said, I just think there's a huge thing to turning up. And I think from my parents, an ability to kind of talk my way into things and network. And And I just turned up at every tech event there was in the early days. I turned up, even when I was in the political consulting. And I'd walk into rooms and listen to lots of people, make sure I took their names and numbers, and I would ask them who else they could introduce me to. I used to have the saying, never leave a meeting without 3 names and numbers, and get introductions. And this is not a bashful country, and there's no reason to be bashful here. And so that's what I would do, and just kind of ask my way around. I don't think there was any more to it than that. And I guess it's good to, there's this thing that they now call the imposter syndrome. I don't think it had a name 25 years ago. Imposter syndrome was like a first cousin of fake it till you make it. Still today, I can talk a lot of technology talk. I don't really understand it. I was riffing on something called DeFi. Do you all know what DeFi is? DeFi is distributed finance. It's like the next wave of cryptocurrencies past Bitcoin and it's crypto protocols and crypto financial infrastructure. And I kind of know the words. I don't even fully know them, but I can kind of carry on a 10-minute conversation before somebody figures out that I'm an actual neophyte at it. And I think that's important just about everything you do. Didn't stop me from investing it, but it's kind of fake it till you make it. And I think that's a valuable skill. As long as you're able to say also, I don't know along the way, it kind of works. I think it's an important skill. It's part of sales.
It's just to follow up on that then, we're all familiar with the Startup Nation. We're all familiar, which is, I think, quite amazing over the last number of months during the height of the pandemic, which is unfortunately still continuing. We've had a tremendous growth of Israeli unicorns. Unicorns, for those who are not aware, Israeli companies that are valued over $1 billion. I think there's something like close to 50 today. I don't know, you'll know better. So what do you attribute to that? You know, beyond the book, Startup Nation, from your experience, what is it that allows Israelis to innovate so well and to and during something like a pandemic continue to grow their companies? And what are the trends as well that you're seeing?
This is a pretty broad question, and it's important to address it very, very broadly. But the first thing I'll say is I hate the term unicorns. It was invented by Eileen Lee. She deserves all the credit in the world.
You're a camel? Are you a camel?
Yeah, kind of a camel guy. But in general, it's like it made the valuation the hallmark of getting things done. And that's the wrong measure. The right measure are revenues, profits, and productivity of employees. And she focused the bullseye on exactly the wrong thing, in my view. And like I said, I have the utmost respect for Eileen because she coined the term, and it stuck. But it's like, the great entrepreneurs don't make valuation their goal. The great entrepreneurs make change their goal. And that's what matters. And they want to create big, lasting businesses. The valuation follows. And so broadly, it's important to understand what's happened in this pandemic. There's obviously the health consequences. But what's really happened is we're all on Zoom. I mean, did everyone, anyway, it's like teachers could have given shiurim, or Rabbanim could have given shiurim, or all around the world for the last 10 years, but nobody did it. And we could have all paid with Venmo or Bit or whatever it is for the last 5 years, but the vast majority of people didn't do it. But the pandemic has forced digitization to the forefront and accelerated it by a decade, at least. And so if you're in the digital economy, broadly speaking, writ large, you are a beneficiary of a decade of digitization compressed into 1 year. And that's dramatic. That has a dramatic impact on our lives. It has a dramatic impact on society. It has a dramatic impact on social structures and a dramatic impact on the nature of communications, which undergirds most of this. And so what's working in Israel, and why these valuations are creeping up, is this vast acceleration of digitization, and the high-tech economy accounts for a significant portion of the economy. And at the same time, two other things are going on. One is, this requires like a larger economics course, but banks are printing money. I mean, federal banks or Federal Reserve central banks are printing money. And when there's zero interest rates. And so if you want to make a return on your money, you can't buy bonds because there's no interest rate. And roughly, if you print a lot of something, increase the supply, the value goes down. So the value of a dollar is going down, not just against the shekel, just in general, against gold, against commodities, against the shekel. And so where are you going to put your money? You can't put it in like old economy companies because they're getting disrupted by a 10-year acceleration of digitization. So you put it in tech companies, which drives their valuations up. And all sorts of money is going into tech. In addition to that, what used to be the tech companies were like software businesses. Like Zoom would always been a tech company. But today, for example, even 5 years ago, people think of Tesla, which is a car company, as a tech company. And I'm an investor in a company called Lemonade, which is an insurance business. But that's a tech company today because it's been digitized entirely from the ground up. And if you look at Lemonade, one of the reasons it looks like a digital company is they're able to handle, I think it's almost 100x the number of customers per employee as like State Farm Insurance and Allstate. I can't remember the exact number, maybe it's 50. It's a huge number because it's digital. And then at the same time, we have mass employment dislocation. This is not as much of an economic crisis at a national level as it is an employment crisis, where some 10 to 20% of employed people, and that includes people who own their own businesses in many cases, restaurateurs, as an example, hair salons, and employees have found themselves out of work. Unfortunately, deeply unfortunately, these are a lot of the people who are low income earners in the economy. And at the same time, digitization, which is accelerated in lots of parts of the economy, has uncovered kind of silent unemployment in many companies. So, for example, if you were a bank in Israel, Bank Apollim, just an example, you had a lot of people you probably didn't need, but you had to deal with the union that you couldn't keep them in there. Well, came along Corona, and all of a sudden you had an excuse why you can get rid of a lot of this hidden unemployment. And so that's put a huge number of people out of work, which is a tragedy. And this goes back to Rav Amital's point of many years ago, which is that if you can help people earn an honest income, it's not just that they're productive and society's productive. It helps at home. It helps with their shalom bayis. It's super important. People out of work for a long time or even a short time is a human tragedy, and incumbent upon all of us to try to fix it and help it. But we're in a structural shift in the economy right now that's accelerating. And how you bring whatever the number is, 10 to 20% of the workforce in the US or Israel back into the 21st century economy when a lot of their skills don't match it is a conundrum. And it's something that requires a large effort, and one that most governments are ill-equipped to handle, which means that must devolve to the citizenry, to you and me and everybody else. I'll point out, Amar Musgar, as they say, that never once in the Torah, never once does the Torah say the government should provide for X, Y, and Z. It's nowhere. It's not anywhere. Go look. Every time it says achicha. It says one time after your fellow, your brother. It's achicha. The Torah, and I would argue that Yiddishkeit in general, does not believe in devolving responsibility for our fellow unemployed people, for people who've fallen on hard times, to the government. That is a unworkable solution. They can't move fast enough to solve the problem. And it's an uncivic solution at the end of the day. And it won't work. And it particularly won't work in the 21st century when things are moving quickly. And the Torah got this 4,000 years ago or so. And I think it's important to note that. when Corona started, I launched an organization called the Mofet, and we consulted with Professor Dan Ariely. Who said to me, the societies with the largest amount of arvut hadadit, mutual responsibility, will come out of this the best. He's dead right. And those that don't, rupture. And that's what we're witnessing. And it's a big challenge to us. That's when the Torah anticipated. Read through Parshas Bahara and Bechukosai. Read through. You'll note that in Bechukosai, in Bahara, sorry, B'chiamucha chicha, Echzaktabo, Gervus Oshav B'chayimach, the mitzvah of Shemitah, what happens in the mitzvah of Shemitah? So they all fight about the fruits and vegetables, Narishkeit. What happens in Shemitah is you open up your fields to let somebody partake of your produce. And why does all the curses in Bechukosai happen? Because you didn't open up your fields in Shemitah. Az tirtzaretz shab soseh ba'ashama. And it's important to recognize that this is something devolved. I'll add, Rabbi Kelly, your permission from this coming week's Parsha of Yisro. We all kind of read the last diber of Lo Sachmod. Lo Sachmod is a very particular Lot Mitzvat Lo Taseh. It's not generic. Although the Ibn Ezra says that it is generic, that you just can't want other things. He gives this very fascinating example. Like he said, you shouldn't want it because it's not plausible, for example, if you're a pauper, that you'll marry the prince's daughter. So why even want something that's off limits? And that's the way you should look at everything else. That's the Ibn Ezra. Shadal follows him. Shadal Shmuel David Lutzato. But if you read the pasuk carefully, it talks about the home, the bayis, the isha, shoro v'chamaro, and then v'chol asher l'reacha. And when you think about what those things are, the shoro and chamaro is, think about it as like the factory. It's the means of production in an agrarian economy. It's like having a factory. And his wife in his house is like what I need to protect fundamentally, both from my income, which serves to provide for that house, and it's what would really throw me off my game if somebody came after my wife at home. And these are fundamental. It's the means of production, means of earning an income, and it's that which is closest to me in this. Now, that's what the Torah tells you not to take. I think is an inclusiveness. We can talk about the Midos HaTorah and address this another time. And when you think about what you do want to desire, lo tachmod, and it's particularly pertinent today, is I should desire to help my fellow brother succeed. Meaning, if he's not spending his time protecting his house and his means of production, he has time to succeed. So the corollary to that is, in a knowledge economy like we have today, I had to go teach him a skill to help him succeed. He should actually desire my brain and skills. That's a positive. Why? Because it's not zero sum. The shor and the chamor is zero sum. If I take your cow and your donkey, your means of production, your factory, you're out of business. But if I mimic your brain, if I mimic your creativity, we've all gained, because it's become a collaborative effort. In that context, I highly recommend the book Creativity, Inc. by Ed Catmull, one of the founders of Pixar. Fabulous book on this topic, fabulous. But the more we mimic each other, the more we create together, the more I desire to be smart like you and learn the same skill you have, the better we get, and we should desire that. That's positive. And I think that's kind of what Torah understands. Don't make lo sachmod a zero-sum game. If it is, don't do it. But if it's accretive, mutually accretive, so hell yes, I ought to desire that.
Okay, I want to ask two more broad questions, then we'll open up to some other questions. Have a few more minutes. You're obviously a major proponent of aliyah. You had a provocative suggestion a couple of months ago that Israel should open up its borders and provide citizenship, some form of citizenship to the best and brightest out there, maybe not even the best and brightest, but to bring people during this pandemic to bring to Israel. What advice would you give to people contemplating, younger people, maybe even older people, contemplating aliyah, both in terms of people who are going to be in the tech field, which is a little simpler, and those who are not tech oriented? What advice would you give them to study, to prepare, that they can be successful and have a successful work life in Israel going 30, 40 years from now as well?
So I actually wrote a book on this topic. It's called in Hebrew, Kacha Yaseh Layehudi, and The Vanishing Jew in English. And it's actually relevant because in less than 30 days is Purim, and the topic is Megillat Esther. And it's a exegesis of Megillat Esther from the perspective of the author, who I think lived in Israel. I think she was saying, I assume that I'm going to make aliyah, but I'm not sure. I think the first thing about making aliyah is the question I always ask is, do you want to live where the Jewish future is or where the Jewish past is? And I am in the tech business because I want to be where the future is, and I want to be in Israel because that's where the Jewish future is. And it's kind of that simple. The what you learn and what you prepare is secondary then to that and to another fundamental question, which is you got to want to be here. Because if you don't want to be here, every little chink in the armor that happens to every immigrant throws you off. And you say, oh, lousy country, you become like the Meraglim. At lousy country, oh, it doesn't work this way in America, it doesn't work this way in England. We find a million things that are wrong. Trust me, there's plenty wrong. Here, America, everywhere. But when we grow up with a certain cultural mindset and things that we're used to, it's actually easier to see the flaws in the place we're not so used to. And so you've got to decide you want to be here. It's like a gut check. It's a core decision. After that, nothing matters. What does that mean? It matters, but that provides the perspective needed to be successful, I think. Doesn't mean that it works out for everyone. My wife and I, really my wife, she says every year around the anniversary of Aliyah, she tells our children that we made the decision so they wouldn't have to. And I subscribe to that. Have to seems to be coming closer and closer, unfortunately. And so what to study what you care about and are passionate about. In my book on Shemot, at the end of Shemot, I say that the core trait for a leader is curiosity. And I decry this notion that Malcolm Gladwell popularized and Anders Ericsson was the first proponent of, this notion of 10,000 hours to become an expert. And then all of a sudden, every parent wants their kids to do something for 10,000 hours so they become an expert. And a guy I like a lot better, Dave Epstein, who wrote a book called Range. He wrote for Sports Illustrated before he took on psychology. So he probably knows a lot more than most because sports is what makes everything happen. And so he wrote a book called Range, where actually what we're looking for is people who have little experience in a lot of different areas because they become curious and they can solve problems and they collaborate and look for other people. And I think the Torah tells us the same thing. Moshe Rabbeinu became the leader because he was curious. He checked in on his brothers. He checked in on the Benot Midian. He checked on this botanical wonder of the tree, the bush burning but not consumed. And it's this kind of notion, I'll become an expert at something, I'll be good at it, I think is nonsense. You need to be a lifelong learner and curious and just stay at it. And then networking, like I said earlier, matters a lot.
Now, my last question is, you look at your accomplishments.
Yeah, I see my parents on here now.
Yeah, you see them also.
As people drop off, you kind of condense the screen. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, welcome. I hope you're chefing lots of nachas. And yeah, so again, a lot of people will look at you, and anybody will look at you and say, how do you do it? You've got 8 kids, you've got grandchildren, you've got a highly successful and very busy business. I see you in pre-pandemic, you go to Minyan, the Shtiblich 3 times a day, you're learning Torah, you write Sfarim. So a 2-part related question is, first of all, what challenges did you have to your own religious growth in the this outside world that you're very part of? And what advice do you have that you have the discipline to find the time to do all these things, to be able to write a sefer? It's not a simple thing. And these are, what can you tell us? What advice do you have?
I didn't actually sit down to write this firm except for one of them. I only sat down to write the Esther book. The rest of it kind of happened. I started writing notes that turned into books, but it was learning. I got my love of learning from my father, who's here, and we're still fortunate to have a weekly chavrusa. If something's important to you, you make time for it. And learning Torah is the anchor of my day. At the end of the day, it's what I start with in the morning. These days I write more, so it's less kind of learning new things and more getting my writings in order. Please God, my book on Vayikra will be out next week. But I can't think of anything more important to start your day with than learning. And it's perspective. My father is very disciplined, and that's a long-term Eisenberg family trait, is being super disciplined. And I'm disciplined for it. And then, I think from, my mom is here, we were always out of balance. My mom was running businesses and having 6 kids at the same time. I don't believe in work-life balance. I told this to the guy in the podcast that's getting published next week. Yeah, and then Daphne was born, but I was out of the house. But, he said to me, what recommendations do you have for work-life balance? And I told him, don't pursue it. I literally don't believe in balance. I think the world is not balanced. Just look at the last year. Surprises happen all the time. And I think when people say, search your work-life balance, it's a false promise that frustrates a lot of people and therefore is bad advice. And so you just try to be as good as you can at everything, at being a parent, at being a spouse, at being a child, at working, at learning. And things are out of balance. And some days I don't get to finish my learning in the morning. My kids come in, need help with a Zoom or whatever it is. And some days I'm probably not such a good parent, as the case may be. And you just, you kind of learn to live with that. And I do want to answer your question about the religious growth. And I apologize if I offend somebody right now. I have not had any wavering in belief in God. It hasn't happened to me. I spent all my day in science. My partner, who I love dearly, Eden, is a sworn atheist. We love each other deeply. He's a wonderful partner. We've discussed and debated it respectfully. But I have I have not wavered, and it's important to understand why. I read many years ago that Esha Torah had proof of the Torahs being given at Sinai and proof of God's existence. Let me help you out. Proof is a scientific word. You have a thesis, you try to prove it, and it's as good as long as it exists. Belief doesn't require proof. In fact, it lives where proof doesn't exist. And so belief, one should actually, in my view, not be seeking proof, because as soon as you prove it, you'll cease to believe it. They're opposites, actually. And God exists in uncertainty. And belief in God is not just helpful, but is, I think, paramount in uncertain times, which we live in now. And so the biggest challenge, actually, that I've had religiously is countenancing a lot of rabbinic statements by people that some people think are holy people, that I think have totally lost the narrative and lost touch with society and humanity and other members of Klal Yisrael. And I think Klal Yisrael comes ahead of what many people think is steigen or learning Torah. And my biggest challenge has actually been trying to look at my day, which is hour by hour in Torah and mitzvahs, and working, and look at other people, l'chora, a priori have that same approach, but which Rabbanim, in my view, have just come off the rails. And I don't know any other way to say it. And that's my biggest challenge right now, if you want to know.
Okay, there's a lot more to discuss, a lot more to talk, but I'm going to now bring in some other people. I have a question for you.
And so, wait, Rabbi Kim, I'll add one thing.
Yeah.
Don't let, and this is kind of the point, the acts that you find unappealing, or an approach to Torah that you find unappealing, distract you that there is a God. They're not one and the same. Christianity believes that there's a direct line between God or the Trinity and the Pope. We don't. We believe the community is more powerful.
Thank you. Correct. Yes. Okay. Perhaps another time we'll hear from you about how you can bring in some of those communities in Israel to the workplace, but we'll save that for now unless somebody wants to follow up on that. But I have a question from a current college student, and I'll just quote him. If you could, going back to the discussion earlier, if you have built a professional network in the US, he's in the States right now, contemplating aliyah after college, how do you go about trying to build that network after moving to Israel? Additionally, employers who are hiring analyst entry-level employees who are post-army usually are 25, 26 years old. How do you convince people in Israel to work with a 21, 22-year-old fresh college grad?
I didn't have a network in the US for what it's worth when I moved here or in Israel. And it's the same thing I said earlier. You just got to turn up. Professor Rosabeth Kantor at Harvard Business School, who I have a lot of admiration for, and her writings, lists kind of the 5 traits of leadership. And the first one is turning up. And you'd be shocked, by the way, how few people turn up. And so how do you network? You turn up. I flew, I'm not necessarily encouraging this, particularly in the age of Zoom, but when I got started, there wasn't Zoom, there wasn't all this stuff. I was flying every month, sometimes more frequently, to California and New York, and just turning up. And my schedule was packed from 7:30 in the morning to 11:30 at night, seeing as many human beings as possible. And during this time, it's been very helpful to have those relationships to call on. And I did the same here. I turned up and asked for 3 names, and from everybody, and just kept meeting people. And early in your career, the most important thing is to meet people. Now, my kids tell me you can do it on Zoom now. I don't find this terribly warm, but or relationship building. It feels like Hollywood Squares, like you're watching a game show. But many people may not even know what that is. But and then the second question, I don't think anyone in Israel cares about your age. They care about how curious you are, how well prepared you are, what you know, what you've researched. Unlike in the US, where I find there's like how you prepare for an interview. In Israel, how do you prepare for an interview? You know as much as possible about the company, its tech, its people, and come with an insight, even something as chutzpah as saying, hey, I got an idea for your business. In America, they might think that's a good idea, but here they get extra credit for that. Your age doesn't matter.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? That again, I have a lot more, but I just wanted to give people a chance. Maybe I'll just give one more, which is basically where I kind of asked this before, but we spoke about a lot of different things. But where you see Israel going in the next 20 years, some of the challenges you alluded to, I alluded to just now, where you have a large percentage of the workplace that is not really gainfully employed. What challenges do you see going forward for Israel maintaining its status as a startup nation and continuing to create these incredible companies that you discussed?
I think in general, one is I'm like a tireless optimist. That's the first thing. Having said that, I think if you want to be realistic, these next bunch of years are going to be challenging everywhere. I don't think this pandemic is here and gone. I don't buy that narrative. I think it's important to tell people that. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope and pray I'm wrong. But I think we're in for a bunch of uncertain years on many fronts. For another time, we can have a geopolitical discussion. Health-wise, geopolitically, economically, we're in a giant transition on many vectors right now, on many, many vectors. And so I think the next bunch of years could be challenging in many places and in Israel too. But in every challenge, there's huge opportunity. I, for one, am not fond of pursuing the startup nation narrative anymore. I think it was amazing work. I've called them my heroes, Dan Senor and Saul Singer, quite publicly, for having coined that best retroactive branding ever. And they did an amazing job of that. But I think we need to ask what's next. And I think what's next is something along the lines of a economy of brotherhood or a brotherhood economy, where we need to expand the prosperity and the job enablement for more and more people. And I think that means extending it to other populations. I think that means a giant upskilling effort. And we got a lot of work to do. And like I said before, I think that devolves to citizens. So I'm super optimistic about Israel, and I'll name the reasons. One, I think we're on the right side of economic history in terms of where our economy is headed in terms of innovation. And I think that matters a huge amount. Number two, despite the fractiousness, despite the mudslinging and the intertribal Facebook assaults that you have and Twitter nonsense, at the base level of Israeli society, there is a much larger level of mutual responsibility of arvut hadadit than there is almost anywhere else in the world right now. And it shows up at crisis times. Unfortunately, I wish it would show up at other times. But at the base level here, that exists. And I think that's going to be super important, for the next couple of decades. And the third thing I think is that Israelis are resilient. And people want to be a part of a resilient society. I think you've seen that with the vaccines. It's a resilient society. And so I anticipate, and this goes back to a question you asked at the beginning, that our population is going to grow here a lot faster than most people think. And demographics is destiny, meaning economies grow alongside demographics. Lots of people are having children here, not just one sector of the society. And two, I think there's going to be much larger immigration than people think. And I think eventually we'll get the visa issue right and be able to attract more brain power and hearts to this country. So I am long-term super optimistic around Israel. Think this is where the future of the Jewish people is. I'm pretty certain in New York, Miami, or Sao Paulo, as the case may be, or London. And I think the more people we have of the more diverse backgrounds from where they come from, you create bridges to other parts of the world. I have a program that I started together with a woman named Abby Owen called Nevo Network. You can look it up. It's a post-aliyah fellowship and professional network. It's like you asked the networking question before. How do you get integrated in Israeli society? So we created an on-ramp. First set of fellows, 21 fellows. They get enrichment, integration into Israel, and an Israeli mentor who works at a first-class high-tech company. So that gives them the network, and then they share their mentors, so everyone becomes one network. And one of the guys who comes from Buenos Aires wrote me a note a couple weeks ago that he finally gets what this is, and it might not have been in the original plan, but we now have people who hail from 6 countries, in that case, many states in the U.S., who are well integrated and successful in Israeli high tech, who speak the cultural language of Mexico, Argentina, the U.S., UK, Switzerland, and Brazil. And I think those bridges will increase the surface area that enables more people to come.
Okay, we have a question which I think a number of people are wondering. If you see in the chat group from David Frankel, why doesn't Michael run for prime minister or some other political office? How would you bring up the rest of the country? That is many senses third world to first world. I think those are 2 separate questions, but you can address the first question. If I think
people underestimate how hard that job is to be the prime minister of Israel. I think it might be the hardest job in the world, by the way, harder than being president of the United States. And it's a thankless job. And so I think people also underestimate how much time gets wasted in politics. And it looks glamorous and these people stay out there, but there's a lot of work to do without being in politics. And there's, as I said before, I think the Torah guides us to be achicha and not to be the melech, and or the sar tzava necessarily. And so I prefer to be of service and volunteer in other areas. I don't think I'm cut out for politics.
Okay, you want to throw, and the second part of the question was, how do you bring up the rest of the country, I guess, from parts of the country that are quote unquote third world to first world? And we'll finish with that.
I don't think we live in a third world country at all. I don't think anybody in this country is in the third world. First of all, I think 9.5 million people are super fortunate to live here, to have a health system as well developed as it is, which Ben Gurion imagined, and Chaim Ramon, who doesn't get enough credit in my view, really institutionalized and digitized. How fortunate we are to be living in a growing economy, in a place where you can stand up in the middle of the square and tell the prime minister to get out. It's stunning. It's really stunning. Like, this is a free country with a growing economy and a military, and Jews have been protected for 70 plus years. That's like super fortunate. So no one here is living in a third world country, and no parts of society are third world either. They may have different views on technology. They may have different views on family. They may have different views on religion, but they're not in the third world. Now, I'm not Pollyannish either. That doesn't mean that we don't have an issue where you've got, I'm making up the number, 1.5 million people in the economy, maybe 2 million, who are not honing skills for a 21st century economy. Maybe it's 2.5 million. The number's large. It's not small. The whole high-tech business, for what it's worth, is like 300,000 people in this country, and then call up tenant businesses on top of that's another 1.5 million people. And so the question we need to ask is, what is the positive incentives and positive temptations of brotherhood to bring more people, both within Israel and from without Israel, into this economy and create more prosperity? And so I think a lot of the tactics that have been taken have been beating people on the head, and the stick and not the carrot. And I think we need to move more to carrots and less to sticks. Greed is a bigger motivator than fear. That's number one. Number two, every society that wants to get ahead needs models that you can copy or mimic. That's how society moves ahead. No one ever thought of the internet in Israel until a couple of guys with raggedy hair, 4 guys with raggedy hair, started ICQ and started the instant messaging craze. But they became cultural icons, much in the same way that the founders of Google, Facebook became cultural icons. And Steve Jobs became a cultural icon around too. And that brings people in. But you need to create cultural icons of those communities in order to bring them into the economy. And that takes time. It does not happen overnight. You can't microwave it. And so, what I suggest is not patience, but activism for how, if everybody on this call strapped 5 people on their shoulders who is in a community that's not in the innovation economy and said, I'm going to help you get the skills to do that, make a hero out of you in your community, we'd go a long way. There's 20-something people on here times 5, it's 100 people. They'd influence another 10 people. We'd be on our path. But you got to spend time on it. That's the best way to multiply the success.